Praise God. The Lord is good. Well, we're at the last session of our Genesis series, and as I kind of looked over it and thought about it, we probably could have done another month. As you know, I've really ran through a lot of stuff, taking a little bit of liberty to stop here and there, and to make some different points that I felt the Spirit of the Lord was signifying. But what I'm hoping is that you're getting a clear understanding of what God did at the beginning. Because what he did at the beginning is what he is fulfilling now. It's interesting, when you look through the New Testament, you pick up a lot of details about what we're studying in the book of Genesis. Redemption, the great plan of God to redeem mankind, all the way back in chapter 3 of Genesis. From the third chapter of the book, we're talking just a spit's throw out from the very beginning when God created man. He's already talking about and developing and executing his plan of salvation. And we go back and we look at it in the development, and we see what the effects of sin created and God's attitude towards that in the flood. And these things have to be real to us. Sometimes I think we think that we're skating through by, doing certain things and, well, there's no consequence. I guess God missed that one. No, he didn't. He didn't miss it. And he already pronounced his judgment on those things. And a lot of people will say, well, why doesn't God, for example, judge America when you look at our abortion situation? Why doesn't he? Well, he's already showed us Sodom and Gomorrah. He's already told us what he thinks about it. So judgment is either happening, I personally believe that it is happening, because you see the absolute craziness of man in our day. You see how God has given us over to the lusts of our flesh. I'm not talking specifically about the church, although the church is in a weakened state as well. But in the world, all bets are off. Pandora's box is open. The things that are going on today are unspeakable. Unspeakable. So we see and we gain information about the fact that God is holy, that he's pure, that he does not wink at sin. This is one of the great things that we see. And then at the same time, we see his great love being poured out, because he knows how decrepit humanity is and how broken. He got to the place where he said, I simply have to destroy it all. It pains my heart that I've made it. I'm going to destroy it all. And then one man who finds grace in the sight of the Lord. And this is the whole process, knowing where it's going to end up, all over again. Why? Because he has this undying, fervent, burning love to have fellowship with you and with me. He saw you down the pipe. He saw you coming. And he knew that some. And what he did for all. His salvation in Christ is for all. Me, all you that labor, he said, right? But just a few come. But he did all that he did for the few that come. So we see that the wonderful lessons that the whole Bible teaches us about the compassion, about the mercy and the goodness and the love of God. We see it in these. They have to be recorded on our hearts, ingrained into us. As I just started to do some study on the nature of love. And I think I'm going to be doing a course next year on the nature of love. And I'm already excited. It's already like just churning on the inside. This need of man. Loved by God, to know that he's loved by God. That is the thing that establishes your total identity. It's what affirms you as a person. It's what makes life worth living. I won't get to all that right now. But Genesis is full of the compassion and the love, the mercy, but also the judgment of God. Remember I asked you last week to ponder a little bit, what did you learn about God? And at the end, when we get to the end, we'll talk about it a little bit and see some of the things that you have discovered about the Lord. There's a lot. I mean, this is just two things, that I'm talking about that are, very broad, but there are a lot of specifics that we've seen about the good hand of God. But we've also seen the development, and we've seen how God has gone from this big, huge plan, and he's honed it down right to a man. That man was Abraham. And with Abraham, he was going to put in motion this plan of salvation to bring who? To bring Messiah, right? To bring the Christ. And it was going to be through Abraham. So what we see is God honing down from all these men, focusing on one, and then starting with that one to do what? To build a nation. Right? He narrows it all down to one man. He says, this is the guy I'm going to use. I'm going to work through him. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to expand him. I'm going to make his heritage like what? Like the stars in the heavens and like the sand on the seashore, right? And how he did it. He gave him one son, but he made him wait for that son. And then he had to sacrifice that son. And we started to see this theme that we're going to be talking about today, that whole idea of sacrificial love, and how God was sowing that whole seed of sacrificial love into the heart of his people, who would bring the Messiah, who would be the sacrificial love for all mankind. Right? And we talked about how Jacob and Esau had their struggles, and eventually it was God that chose Jacob over Esau, although normally, according to inheritance, Esau, but he despised his inheritance, and God knew their hearts, and God gave it to Jacob even before they did even good or bad, the Bible says. All the grace of God, the mercy of God, God's choice, God's election, God's hand doing all of these things, God choosing, right? His way, not our way. Grace and not works. We talked a little bit about some of those different things. And we're starting to see that Jacob, through a very strange manner, has acquired 12 children. Right? Through how many women? 2 times 2. 4, right? There are actually, at least 4.
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. So you had who? Who was the first? Leah. Who was the first? And was the second? Rachel, right? Rebecca was the mom. Rachel, right? There was the 2 maids, Zula and begins with a Beliah, something like that. I don't have their names memorized. I'm lucky to remember my own name these days. But then you see how God gave him all of these children, and how the family is beginning to grow. And now what we're witnessing here, we've started to talk about how God separated Joseph and sent him on ahead to do something that nobody could have possibly conceived, right? God is starting to create a womb. The womb, a womb of a nation. He's going to take this small people, 70 souls, plus all the servants and all that, but it was 70 of their families, 70 souls, bring into Egypt, into a particular land, and they're going to grow. And they're going to become a mob. They're going to become greater than the nation in which they live. And there's going to be all kinds of tensions created, right? And God's going to send somebody by the name of Moses to take them out, right, of Egypt in God's great deliverance, which is what became for Israel a testimony and that they would look back to as their national identity throughout the ages. So we're seeing in this section here the full development of God bringing this small band into Egypt so that he can multiply them in a fruitful place. He's going to multiply them and 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 multiply them. You know, it's kind of funny. We lived in Europe for many years. I can tell you, she can confirm what I'm going to say. Not racist, it's just a fact, what I'm going to share. Okay, so Europeans have like 9 children. In other words, per family. Less than 1 child per family, statistically. So, you know, each family may have 1 child. Well, because they're such great liberals, they opened the floodgates to different oppressed people. The Moroccans, for example, in Belgium is the Moroccans. In France, it's the Algerians, and so on and so forth. Now, 25, 30 years after they opened those floodgates, they have a huge problem. Because now they're being overrun. Because the Belgian families that have 0.9 children compared to the Moroccan families that have children. So that they are becoming very quickly more than the actual, and you're seeing these big problems in some of you perhaps have seen some of the things that went on in France recently. Maybe you're not as attuned to those things as I am. But you had heard maybe there's a magazine called Charlie Hebdo, and they made some cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad. Right? This was a couple of years back. Well, there was a teacher just recently in a class that showed those pictures to his class, and the Muslims in his class told him, don't do that. If you do that, there's going to be reprisals. They cut off his head in Paris. And there's all kinds of stuff going on right now in throughout the Muslim world. Turkey's up in a snuff. I mean, there's all. They opened the door, they integrated. The whole point was they multiplied. And this was exactly what was going on in Egypt when God brought them in there. He multiplied them so they got to the point, and this is obviously getting into the book of Exodus, but they get to the point where they say, we have to subjugate this people because they're more than we are, they're stronger than we are, and if an enemy comes against us, they're going to rise up from within and create a huge problem. Right? But what I want you to see today is simply the fact that this is the open door to all of that history that you see from Exodus all the way through. All the way through. So getting a good understanding, a good comprehension of how God is doing this will aid you in your comprehension of the eternal plan of God, or really the earthly plan of God, which leads to the eternal plan of God for us. It's a marvel. Who would think of that? Right? God, right? How am I this nation? Well, I'm going to start it with just one little family, and I'm going to take it and stick it in the middle of a developed nation, and they're going to become bigger than that nation that I put them into. And then, when I decide I'm going to take them out of that nation, I'm going to rip a nation out of a nation. That's never been done. That had never been done. It's never been done since. It's a marvel. And it's the thing that God told Israel to constantly look back to have faith and hope and trust in God. Right? So that's what we're looking at, and from that particular perspective. So, in our story, we're going back really to 42, and we're just going to kind of blow through some of this because I don't want to spend too much time with all the detail. That's why I give you the notes, right? So you can look them over, and of course you have your own reading. So the narrative returns to Israel's camp. We find them feeling the effects of the famine. You remember that Joseph is now there. He's interpreted the dreams, and it's beginning a time of famine. He's there at God's request, right, to direct all of the affairs of Egypt. And of course, God knows that his family, the family of his friend Abraham, is also going to be affected by that. And he's going to use those circumstances to create movement. And this is something that we learn about God. And if you look at it from, use a theological word, many of you heard the word providence, right? Right? Who has not heard that word? Providence. Okay, so providence is basically the fact that God looks ahead and makes provision. God looks ahead regarding his plans and his purposes, and he makes provision step by step by step to see the fulfillment of his plan or purpose for a particular group of people or a particular individual or a circumstance or a situation. And this is another one of those great things, that the hand of God, right, that we've been seeing right from the beginning. God doing this, going back to Abraham. He's there, and he's got to take his son up Mount Moriah to sacrifice him, and his son asks him, I see the fire, I see the ropes, I see the knife, where's the sacrifice? What does Abraham say?
God will provide.
God will provide. The providence of God. Right? And he gets up there and he raises it, and God says, whoa! And he hears the rustling in the back, and there's the animal caught by its horns. The ram is caught by its horns. And that was God's provision. Intercession, right? Instead of your son, offer this. Which actually, that was what the tithe was based on, even throughout, using the law. The tithe was given in place of taking the son, the firstborn. Right? That's why they gave those. That's why, when Jesus was born, because it was a poor family, they brought turtle doves and they offered them. Well, that was in place of the Lord taking the son, taking the firstborn, right, unto himself. So that was what took place there. That's what that was for. Unknown to them, God is using this famine, to move them towards Egypt by his providential hand, which will become the womb where a nation will be birthed over a period of 400 years. Mm-hmm. This is what I love about God. 400 years for God it's like a drop. It's like a drop in the bucket. It's nothing. And yet we 400 years, and it's like 16 lifetimes. Right? Depending on how long we live. I mean, we can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow. We may think we can. Well, I got my schedule. I've got my agenda. Plans change real fast. I mean, there is so much that's completely out of our control that we can make our plans, we can make our agenda, and often, we can kind of keep to we have the proverbial interruption, right? You have to make way for interruptions that are beyond your control, right? Now, God doesn't look at things that way because there's nothing beyond his control. He can control anything and everything all the time. And he intervenes when it's necessary, right? To set the course for his plans and for his purposes. Things that we see, 400 years he's going to lead them. They're going to be subjugated. They're going to become slaves. God often uses natural circumstances to work out his plan. Jacob grasped the situation around him and heard that there were supplies available in Egypt. Now this was something that was funny. So he can see that his family is in want. He kind of sees his sons, just kind of huddling. That's how I envision it. They're kind of, well, what do you think, Simeon? What do you think we should do? And Judah responds, well, geez, I don't have any idea. There's nothing in the field. The animals, and all they're doing is complaining and talking about all the problems. And here's Jacob looking at these clucks. And he's looking at them, he said, what is wrong with you? I've heard that there's food in Egypt. Get up and go get some. I mean, do the obvious thing, right? You don't have to stand, you don't have to pray, you don't have to fast. You're going to be fasting a lot if you don't do something. If you know what to do, do it, right? If it's that obvious before you, then do it. do this. And he's just, and it's kind of comical, you know, the situation. He says, now when, well, I'll just read it to you. Now when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, why do you look one upon another? No, why are you standing there looking at each other like you don't know what to do? What's wrong with you guys? And he said, behold, I have heard that there is corn in Egypt. Get you down thither. Get out, get out. And buy for us from there, that we may live and not die. Sometimes the most obvious thing is the door God is opening. Stop wondering, Jacob told his sons, and go get what we need. You know, sometimes in church, some of us Christians that have been around maybe too long, you know, we're always waiting for some sort of a spiritual woo before we do anything, but the door is quite obvious. He's right before you. Just open the door and walk through, right? Some things are just that obvious. Not all things. Some things are just that, you don't have to spiritualize everything, right? If you need food, you know what? Get in your car, go down to Kroger, get what you need, and bring it home. Don't stand there, oh Lord, where's the raven coming? He's not coming. God gave you that little piece of plastic, you know, that's connected to your bank account, the little debit card. You go to in when you want to buy your Coca-Cola, your meat, or whatever it may be. Stop looking at me. Go get it. Right? I mean, it's just that simple. God will have made the provision. That's the assumption. It's a faith assumption. And God is pleased with that kind of assumption. It's not presumption. It's a faith assumption. God has provided in the past. God will provide now. And God will provide in the future. He will not fail me. He cannot fail me. He's my God. Right? So these are the things that we learn from him. Now, they didn't know what to expect, the sons, the brothers, when they went to Egypt, but it definitely wasn't about to happen. Right? It definitely was about to happen. Because he was older and dressed like an Egyptian and spoke to them only through an interpreter. When they got to Egypt, they bowed down to the man. And that must have been quite a moment. A moment of for Joseph, but also an emotional storm. You know, when you see the brothers that sold you for 20 pieces of silver standing, not even standing before you, but bowing before you, according to the dream that you had, which was the reason why you're where you are, and went through all the things you went through, what is going to be rushing through your heart? I mean, just from a natural point of view, I might have taken out my stick and maybe, you know, just have fun for a little bit, because they weren't going to be retaliating. He could have taken vengeance upon them right then and there. He could have thrown them in prison. They were in his hand. But this is the wonderful thing that we see about that sacrificial love that's already in the heart of Joseph. He's already comprehended to a certain degree that he's not there because of what they did. Now they were responsible for creating that pathway, which may or may not have been the God's plan. Nonetheless, they were part of that, and their evil deed did not go unseen or unfelt. Joseph was going to be carried, or was carried through a very troublesome time, years. You know, he was approximately 17 years old when his story began, where we pick up the story. So he spent about 13 years enslaved and then imprisoned before God saw fit to introduce him into the hierarchy of Egypt. That's a long time for God to chisel on you. I'm just saying. That is a long time to have God constantly correcting you and chiseling you and moving in you and working out his love in you. When he could have become the most bitter man on earth. His whole family, besides his father, abandoned him. Not only abandoned him, but sold him as a slave. Now, that's good cause for. And although Joseph does start to play some games with them, and I wouldn't, games is perhaps not a great word, but it's hard to imagine that he wasn't having just a little bit of fun. Even if in general he didn't, this is like with us. There are things that serve us from time to time that aren't our character, but sometimes there's a little dark pleasure in us when we see certain people get what's coming to them. Ever been there? We do. And to think that Joseph was so pristine that these temptations didn't knock at his door is a bit naive. He was still flesh and blood. He was something special. There's no question about that. But he was still flesh and blood, and he was still smarting for the pain and the agony that he'd gone through. As we'll see, we probably won't get to it, just to be honest with you. But nonetheless, when his sons were born, right, you look at the names that he gave. The Lord, Manasseh, I think, was the Lord has made me to forget my family and the afflictions. And then Efrain, the Lord has prospered me in the land of my afflictions. So you see that he was afflicted. He had pain. He had difficulty. He had struggles. But he overcame them. This is the wonderful thing about Joseph. He was able to lock that stuff down in favor of the general movement of God, the overall plan of God. He had that power to perceive what God was doing in a grander scale, not just his own personal suffering. And this is the thing that is so special about him. And it's such an example for us. The love of God was working in him. Like I say, he knew that his life, those 13 years, were a sacrificial love to preserve and to save his family. And the end, and I'm jumping kind of all over the place, but I'm just kind of trying to bring it together under this one theme of the sacrificial love. He says, look, later on, he's going to say to them, look, it wasn't you that sent me here. It was God that sent me here. It was God that took me on this journey. It was God that brought me here to preserve you. And you can almost sense a holy joy in his heart. That yes, I had to go through a lot of pain, a lot of difficulty, but look, you're being saved. And look how many people out there in this whole region that is under this severe famine are being saved. They're not dying because God gave wisdom and God gave a plan and God showed us what we ought to do. And it's working like a charm. He got caught up in the vision of God, and because he was caught up in the vision of God, he could put his own life into perspective. That's pretty good right there. That should have got at least an amen. And that's what me and you, right? Bring it down to your life. Yeah, okay, you're passing through some times, some bruises, some difficulties and so on, but there's a bigger plan. You're part of God's salvific plan. You're part of, God has said, I want to collaborate with you to see other people saved and come into the kingdom. I want to use you in your neighborhood or wherever your feet may travel to be a representative of me. That's the bigger picture. And after that, there's the land of Canaan, there's heaven, there's eternity, there's the New Jerusalem, there's all these wonders that I have prepared for you. This is what was working in the heart of Joseph. And that, it's Psalm 105, and I can't remember the exact word, but it says, until the time of the word came, the word of the Lord tested him. The word of the Lord tried him. Was he going to hold on to it, or was he going to let it go? And we're starting to see the evidence that even through all of his difficulties and all his sacrifice, he was comprehending that his exaltation, and this is what I was saying last week, his exaltation was not to lord or to rule over his family or anybody, but it was to save and to serve. And this is Jesus. Jesus himself said, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve and to make my life a ransom for many. So you see that sacrificial love, that whole theme of sacrificial love, grabbing a hold of the heart of the nation. And I mentioned it last week. The Jews have been a nation who have suffered. A people who has suffered immensely, and in particular their prophets, even at the hands of their own people. To be faithful to the Word of God. The Word of the Lord was testing them. The Word of the Lord was trying them. Do you think it's going to be any different for you? No. The promises of God are testing you. The promises of God are trying you. Will you continue to believe when everything goes sideways? Peter said, look, nothing strange is happening to you. Nothing strange is happening to you. This happens to all the saints. All the saints of God are brought down this pathway of discipleship, in which there are trials, there are difficulties, there are strivings. There's hurt, there's pain, there's confusion, there's perplexity. Read the Apostle Paul in Corinthians. We're delivered over to death so that you can live. We're full of perplexity, but we're not overcome. I mean, it's just, I know, in our culture, it's so affluent. Our culture is so affluent that these things are difficult for us to comprehend, that God would use them, because our life is so fluffy in comparison to a great part of the world today, even today. A great part of the world today suffers. I was just communicating with a friend of mine in Guatemala, a guy that I work with down there. They still aren't back even into church. I talked to my other friends last week in Belgium. They're about ready to go into another national shutdown. But the effects that you see in poor countries from this stuff is devastating. We get by with a lot of help from our friends or the government or whatever it may be. We do pretty good in comparison to places that don't have these kinds of structures. My point is that sometimes this kind of message is hard for us to grasp, hard for us to understand, because we expect everything to go right. But God needs to lead us left, sometimes into difficulty, to try us and to test us. Look, I don't want anybody in heaven that hasn't been tried and tested to God's satisfaction. Why? Because I don't want this all over again. I don't want one little bit of leaven to squeak itself into heaven. If you're not fit for heaven, I don't want you there. That's just being honest. If I'm not fit, you don't want me there. Because heaven is worth it. The testing and the trying is an absolute necessity. When we all get to that place that we're seeing in the life of Joseph, that sacrificial love, as he stands with his brothers, and he has power, he has authority, he can do with them whatever he wants. But he decides to simply test them. To simply test them. You're spies! You came here to see our weaknesses. I know you. You think I don't divine? I'm a counselor of Pharaoh, for God's sake. Oh, come on! I'm a counselor of Pharaoh, for God's sake. I'm getting too active, too worked up here. You don't think I know who you are? I know who you're slave. I mean, you're spies. You've come to check us out. And he basically puts the fear, stirs him up. And then he calms down. Right? He must have been a great actor. But because you got to believe, he knew what he was going to do. You're not returning. That father that you told me about, the way he gathered that information from them without them even knowing, without asking them, tell me about your family. They start to tell, oh no, we're good, honest men. And he's watching, oh, well, you guys, do you have any idea who you're talking to? I guess they didn't. They never would have said that, but he got them to tell him, that Benjamin was at home and that Jacob was still alive, so he knew. And he did a plan. Right? And he basically said, okay, prove that you're not spies. One of you is going to stay here. The rest of you are going to return. The next time you come back, don't even ask for me if your youngest brother isn't with you. That will be proof to me that you are honest men. And then, he sends them off with their bags full. And what does he slip into the bag? All their money, right? When they saw that money, what do you think they thought? Oh God, he knows. Because we did this to Joseph. They began, amazing how they connected, right? The things that were going to that one unresolved sin, that thing in their lives that was going to come. They knew they were going to reap someday for that, and they knew that it's happening. They consulted, and then there's those that go, I told you not to do it. There's always one like that. I told you guys not to do this. Now we're reaping this stuff. Because of our lack of mercy and compassion and kindness towards our brother. They knew. They saw it as God chastising them for what they had done to their brother. And you can see that he's starting to this even. He's bringing them to a place of repentance. Using Joseph and his slyness, right, to do it. So they go back and they report all these things to Jacob, of course, and they tell him that they can't go back unless their brother is with them. And of course, at that, he falls out. First of all, he can't believe. He's dumbfounded. Why did you tell him? Well, how could we know? How could we have possibly known that he was going to take this information and use it in this manner? There was no way. He asked us. We told him. That's all there was to it. Why did you tell him? How could you have done such a stupid thing? All right, and so they consumed that portion that they had received from Egypt the first time, and they're starting to run out. And Jacob said, hey, why don't you guys go back down to Egypt? And they bring up this reality once again. Right? We can't go down there unless you allow Benjamin to go with us, right? And then kind of pick that up. And Jacob sees it this way, he just kind of as he's thinking these things through. All these things are against me. It's one of the very well-known phrases, right, from Jacob's life. All these things are against me. He lost Joseph many years ago. Simeon was locked up, and if he lost Benjamin, he says, you will bring down my grave with sorrow to the grave. So this is not light for Jacob. He doesn't know that Joseph is alive. He has already gone through, and it seems like never got over the grief that he bore for his son.
Right.
There are some parents that never get over it. And their whole life becomes all about that grief. And there are 30 years with that. They just never, ever get past it. It's a horrible kind of thing to do.
Yes, Carl?
Yeah.
Question. Why, I don't mean, is it all right if I ask a question or wait for?
Sure, no, it's fine.
So why at first did Joseph say, all you guys are gonna go to prison when you go back?
Uh-huh.
And then 3 days later he says, no, we'll keep one here. And let the other go back. So for those 3 days, he let all those guys just stew there?
Yeah, well, I think that he reconsidered, because of that. Okay, so you gotta realize he was in the heat of the moment when he made that. Actually, I thought about that specific thing. And this was the thing that I came to anyway, is that he had time to kind of evaluate that situation. And I think what it was that compassion rose up in his heart. And he said, there's really no reason to imprison them all. I'll keep one. and you could bet that he was not kept in a dungeon. You could bet that he was kept probably in a private room in Joseph's house. It wouldn't surprise me. But he was under guard. But I think that's what it was. It was that first pronunciation or announcement was in the heat of the moment, and then after several days he thought it through, and that satisfied me anyway.
Sounds reasonable.
It's reasonable. I'm a reasonable kind of guy. So Joseph, Jacob rather, he really couldn't even bear the thought of sending Benjamin. He didn't even want to think about it. But like I say, as time, he realized that it really was the only option. There was no other option available. So something much deeper than I can see was taking place at this point of the story. Sacrificial love was taking root in the hearts of this family, a working and will that would eventually find its culmination in the sacrificial love of Christ. And the moment of truth wasn't far off for Jacob, as the worsening famine necessitated another journey to Egypt. He tells them to take a trip, but they remind him that they can't go unless back to them. And here is where we see another astounding working of this sacrificial love, because at this time Judah steps up. And he says to his father, "Send the lad with me, Benjamin with me, and we will arise and go that we may live and not die, both we and you, and also our little ones." And this is the part here where he says, "I will be sure of him." So what he's saying is, I will be the guarantee for his life. My life for his life. So we see this same strand, this same vibe, this same note of sacrificial love that now is not only working in Abraham and Isaac, in Jacob, it's in Joseph, it's also starting to work in heads. These guys that sold him out of and hatred, willing to give their lives, at least Judah, as a ransom for their youngest brother. So that what? So that their whole family can be saved. This is an amazing turn of events for Judah. This is an amazing outworking of the Spirit of God in his life. I will be surety for him. And you will require him if I bring him not and set him here before you. Then let me bear the blame forever. Now that meant something. Because it's very interesting that he is the direct descendant of Jesus. And what was Jesus going to do in sacrificial love on that cross? He was going to bear the blame. Huh? He was willing to bear my blame on that cross before God. That same vein of sacrificial love. This, he knows. And I think that he was probably thinking in terms of whatever blessing. Because, when we jump all the way over to chapter 50, we're going to see that Jacob hands out the blessings, right? Well, they're not always blessings. Reuben, he basically curses him, disinherits him. He speaks of some of the other ones regarding their character, some of the issues that are in their lives. Others he talks about blessing. He has prophetic words for them. I think I realize cut me if I don't fulfill this. I will lose, in other words, my place in the family inheritance if I do not bring this brother back. All that I have will become his. So it wasn't something that wasn't going to cost him. He wasn't just using flowery words. He realized that there was a real cost. And I think, as we look at it, as we look a little bit into the future, we'll see that just jump ahead. Jacob, right? The same, it resonates in him, and he says, "Okay, I get it. You've offered your life in place of his life. Look, I don't have any other option anyway. Take him, and if I be bereaved, I'm bereaved. If I lose everything, I lose everything. If I go down to my grave with this grief, this unbearable grief, then I go down to my grave in this unbearable grief. But I've got to care for these others. I've got to care for this family." So you can see this sacrificial love that's at work in Jacob too. He's saying, okay, I could suffer dearly. Grief, internal suffering, frankly, is just as bad, if not worse at times, than external suffering or physical suffering. It's the kind of stuff that can literally break your heart. We'll get to a place where their hearts are so broken that they're in disrepair for the rest of their lives. Right? I mean, the world is full of these people. Full. So Jacob enters into that same vein, and he's willing to lay it down. And as you know, we go back and get the food, and there is the meeting, and Jacob sets up the table. He has them for lunch at his house, and oddly, he arranged the oldest to the youngest, and he gives his youngest brother 5 portions, and they're all looking at each other, and it's like, what is going on here? And Joseph is dropping these little hints, and finding time for them to go back and bring this food back to your father, and so forth. And he said, okay, slip those cups in there again, slip that money back in the mouth, but this time slip my divination cup in there too. And again, I don't know about you.
Yeah.
I would have checked, leaving. Let's just make sure, we're not getting set up here again. They didn't. And he also put his cup into Benjamin's sack, right? And then he sends out and they stop him and oh, we're honest men, we didn't do that. But hey, if you find it, then whoever sack you find it, he will be, your servant and blah, blah, blah. Well, they bring him back, and sure enough, they open it up in his presence, and Benjamin is cup, and no, this can't be. And Jacob says, no, I'm not going to take all of you, because they offer, we're your servants, and we'll serve you forever because of this thing, and so on and so forth. George, no, far be it from me to do such a thing. I'm an honest, I'm a just man. Only Benjamin's going to stay. And that's the point of no return for Judah. And that's the point of no return for Judah. What does Judah do? He steps up to the plate, man. He draws close to them and says, I know who you are. I know that, in essence, I'm talking to Pharaoh here, but please hear me out. And he tells him the story. And he tells him that the old man receiving this news, it would break his heart, it would bring him down, and he could not bear it. And he tells him, look, I offered myself as in his place. Please take me, but let the young man. Joseph can't take it anymore. Because he's seeing, right? He's seeing the work of God. He's seeing the culmination of God's sacrificial love at work in an amazing manner. He's saying, look, imprison me, but let my brother go. Let him return to my father. Judah is thinking about everybody except himself. I don't know. To be honest with you, I never saw this before I started studying it for this class. I never saw from the beginning of Genesis how this root of sacrificial love really is the dominant note. I mean, we all look at it that it's the creation, it's all that, and it is all that. But when you look at this and it leads to Christ, to me it has now become the dominant note, really, not only the book of Genesis, but of the Bible. The whole Bible. Yep. All of it is a working in and a working out of this sacrificial love. This same spirit that was in them is in us. And that same spirit is the spirit of Christ. And when Joseph sees this, he breaks. I mean, he's overwhelmed. He begins to cry. And that's when he opens up his heart. I'm Joseph! And they're looking at him saying, what? What's he saying? Hey, wait a minute. He's not speaking to us through an interpreter. He's speaking directly to us. He's speaking our language. And the things are starting to go, oh my God, this is joke. This is joke. I don't know if they were relieved that they didn't kill him or if they were really fearful that they were going to kill him. I'm not even sure what was going on in their minds at that particular moment. But it's an absolutely amazing revelation that he makes to them. And this is exactly where, I think it's chapter 45 we're talking about now, where he begins to reveal to them, this is the culmination of those dreams that I had. All dreams were not to exalt me over you. They weren't to put you under my foot. It was to put you under my care. And that's the whole difference. And if you look at the heart of God, God doesn't have us under his feet. He could. With no problem. We could all be under the heavy, burdensome foot of the judgment of God. All of us. But he said, that's not why I came. Jesus said, I didn't come to the world to what? To condemn the world. I came to save the world. If you believe, you're saved. If you don't, sorry, you're condemned. But that wasn't the purpose. The purpose wasn't to condemn, the purpose was to save. And this is what you see Joseph comprehending. God didn't raise me up to put you under a yoke or a burden, to enslave, to make your lives hard and difficult. It was to save. It was to preserve. He recognized that he was God's providential vessel. That God had set the whole thing up. That God had led him through it. That God had honed him. That God had tried. God had tested him. That word had tested him and proved him. And he finally came to the place where God said, now you're ready. Now I can exalt you because now you're humbled. And he exalted him and he used him to save his brothers. And then from there's a couple of events. I mean, there's a lot of events that are, of course, very important that take place, and we can look at all of those. But he basically comforts them, which is an amazing thing considering the whole story. He comforts them. He said, "Don't be angry with yourselves." I mean, how many of us would say that? I believe a lot of us would. I really, maybe not so much in the past, but today. Why? Because the same Spirit that was working in Joseph is working in you. The same God that worked working in you, working in me. And in those moments, I believe that that's what, they talk about, when you squeeze a lemon, lemon juice comes out. Yeah. So when our lives get squeezed, the real fullness of that life will come out. And hopefully, we will have been honed sufficiently so that the nectar comes out and it really does become a balm, a healing balm for those who are around us. Because that's what Joseph was. He was a healing balm for these guys. They knew they had done wrong. And he is, in essence, forgiving them. He's forgiving them. It's amazing. And, if you look at the Lord Jesus Christ, right, stretched out on that cross, what does he do? He looks up into heaven. What does he say? Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Right? And I'm sure that was the vein in which Joseph was thinking. Look, you didn't understand any of this. You did the things that you did. You didn't know what you were doing. Who am I, he says, to stand in the place of God? It's amazing because, frankly, at that point, he was. He had their lives in his hand, at least their natural lives. But he recognized and he was humble before the Lord God who had exalted him. So who am I to hold on to these things and to judge you? No, God did this. And all of Pharaoh's house, right? This, and there's great rejoicing, and Pharaoh's ecstatic that his brothers are there, and so on and so forth. And he loads the family up, gives them all kinds of carts so he can go down and load up their stuff and bring it in. And again, we see the providential hand of God. These people don't deserve any of this. They said, no, this is Joseph's brothers. As a matter of fact, just forget about everything out there. You just come. I'll give you everything that you need. They didn't do that. They brought all their stuff because Pharaoh probably didn't know how much stuff they had. You got to remember, this is the inheritance of Abraham that's probably been multiplied who knows how many times. And Abraham was one of the most wealthy people in the East at the time. We're not talking, sometimes I don't think we understand, we're probably talking about a couple thousand people. Right? It was a nomadic clan. The family was 70. But all the workers of the fields and all the cattle and all the... Who knows how many people there were? But there would have been a lot of souls. A lot of souls. So here they come, And, Pharaoh had provided all this, and they're coming back into Egypt, and Pharaoh or Jacob meets Pharaoh, and it's interesting that Jacob blesses Pharaoh. Not Pharaoh blesses Jacob. Blesses Pharaoh, right? And Pharaoh is a Jacob. You go, dude, you're like crusty, man. You're like, how old are you? He was about 130 years old. He said, the days of my life have been few and with a lot of trouble. I just love the culture and the interchange and so on and so forth. Few and with a lot of trouble. And then you see, basically, from that point when Jacob comes to Egypt, there's the land of Goshen, and that really does become the leader, right, of the nation. He set him in the most prosperous part of the land, in the midst of famine, right? Not to your own people, but to these foreigners. These foreigners are coming in here, snatching up all our jobs. A lot of animosity, so on and so forth, building up, and that will be building up, throughout the years and so on and so forth. But at that point, Jacob is in the land for 17 years, so he's about 147 years old, and he realizes, right, in chapter 40 and 47, 48, that his time has come, and he begins to set his house in order, and it appears as though he's never met his grandsons, right? Manasseh and Efrain, because they're behind Joseph's legs, very small, and Jacob couldn't see well at the time. He said, who are these two? So either he didn't recognize them or he had never met them. But Joseph introduces them. He said, well, this is my first son, Manasseh. And this is, and he goes, well, bring him to me. I want to bless him. And so Jacob moves Manasseh, the firstborn, to Jacob's right side, right? And Ephraim to the left side. Jacob, he can't see straight, so he crosses his hands. Just looked at it and said, what is he doing? He can't say, no, Father, that's not. He said, I know, son, I know, I can see that far. It's like all these people that tease us old folk for forgetting things and not being able to see. No, I can see. Let it be so, because the Lord has chosen Ephraim. Manasseh will be blessed, but Ephraim will receive the greatest portion of the blessing. And again, you see what? The election of God, the grace of God, God's choice, not man's choice. Not works, but grace. Right at the very end of the story. And then we see, after he prophesies and blesses these two grandsons, basically he does something very interesting. He takes Joseph's sons as his own sons, which is probably a very odd thing in our thinking. But he took Ephraim and Manasseh. Why? You get over to chapter 50, right, where he blesses the other ones. Reuben doesn't receive a blessing. Reuben is cursed. Do you remember why? Reuben did something that was horrendous. He slept with one of his father's concubines, right? Not his mother, but one of his brother's mothers, right? The concubine. So he was removed. And basically, if you look at the 12 tribes, Joseph is not counted as a tribe. I don't know if you ever noticed that in the list. You don't see a tribe of Joseph, right? And you don't see a tribe of Reuben. That's because there was an adjustment in the inheritance because of what Reuben had done. Joseph is counted as a double portion because he was given, what? A portion by his father. The blessing that he gave him was a double portion for Joseph. So the double portion is represented by the tribes of Manasseh and Efraim. So at that point, God Jacob conferred upon Joseph's sons tribehood, if I can put it that way, so that they became 12 tribes of Israel. And that's how Joseph received his double portion, because his brothers, his oldest brothers, lost, right? And because Joseph was obviously favored. And then, it's a very interesting study if you go through and you look at some of the different things that Joseph says, or that Jacob says, because there's a combination of prophetic words, there's a combination of prophetic words with discernment, right? He talks about Reuben and what he's like, and he talks about Levi and his brother Simeon, who, you guys, your anger is horrible. Well, they're the ones that caused him trouble because of their sister Dinah, right? Dinah, right? They set up the country in Shechem and killed all the men of the city and brought great respite against Jacob, and they had to leave and so on and so forth. He didn't forget, huh? He was old, but he didn't forget. and it came out in prophecy, and then in the other ones, it was simply told this would be your inheritance, but by the Spirit of God, huh? He's operating as a prophet, and there's a prophetic thing going on there, and he's telling the things that are going to happen in their lives and where they're going to, what they're going to be like. Dan, you're going to be a judge, and Zebulon, you're going to live, near the sea, and you're going to have, ships and ports and all this kind of stuff. But the most important one is Judah. And the main thing that he says about Judah is the scepter will never depart from your clan. What does that mean? Judah was going to rule. And Judah is the tribe from which David came. After that. And then eventually culminated with who? The king. Right? The King of Kings. The Lord of Lords. So the Lord was showing us through that prophetic word that he had selected Judah, not because he had done anything good, except for the sacrificial love at the end, but because it was his choice. And he brought the Messiah, the King of Kings, through Judah, and that was the great blessing that he had. And of course, now we're at the place where Jacob dies, and one more time the brothers have to Joseph. You know, your dad, just before he passed, you know, he told us to tell you that he said to forgive us. And I'm sure Joseph was just smirking. He said, look, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to take care of you. I will provide for you. I will give you how much love. Remember, God brought me here. God did this thing. God has provided in all these days. And that's basically how the book ends, and they take root in Egypt. Amen. So, I want a few minutes just to find out, you know, what your impressions are from the book of Genesis. What were some of the things that maybe God spoke to you, some of the things that you had not known or understood previously that you do now. Last week I asked you to think about what did you learn about God? How has God opened your eyes to see in a clearer light? Anybody crack at a short summary of what you've seen?
He's always got a plan.
Yes, he does.
He's always got a plan, and he's executing it through ordinary people.
Mm-hmm.
And building their faith through suffering to suffering. When you suffer, you learn obedience.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
And just that from the beginning, he knew the fall, and he already created all of this before.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling to me.
Mm-hmm.
And he brought out a lot of the redemption coming through the book, from the first book,
Right.
which opened my eyes to a lot of things.
Yeah.
You know? Faith,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
it's true, and people tried and tested it,
Yeah.
and that's why they're there.
Right. Absolutely. I think it is really interesting, you know, that you mentioned that he knew all this before it ever happened, and yet still did it. Some would criticize him for it. Some would say, well, if you knew it was going to get this bad, why bother? Right? But to me, it's a testimony of love.
Exactly.
And his desire to love a being with whom he could communicate. Right? And that's what we see in the very plan of God, all the way back to chapter 1. He didn't create us like the animals. I'm sorry, you know, that certain people today want to elevate animals to personhood. They're not. And I'm sorry if there are any grand dog parents in here. You know, all that stuff, weirdness that we go on. They can't communicate with us. Now, God can hear them.
Over them.
Yes, we do. And that's the interesting thing. And it's what I'm getting to is the manner in which God created us is completely distinct in that we are made in his image and in his likeness. I've always been affected by what the psalmist said. What is man that you're mindful of him? What is man that you would visit him? Why does God want to have fellowship with us?
Because we're his kids.
Huh?
Co-heirs of Christ, we are his
as seed.
Well, yeah,
God
but
creates-
why? I mean, why would he do all that? Why would he make us that? What's in it for him?
Family.
Family?
Unconditional love.
Love.
Love and love.
Yeah, but this is one of the things that we learn, right?
Right.
He created us.
No.
He had all that before he created us. See, this is the Trinity. One God in perfect union and unity with himself.
Right.
He was fully and completely satisfied in and of himself. He didn't have to create. That would mean that God had a need. Right? If you were to say God had to create us to love us. No, he didn't.
No.
He did it because he wanted to. He chose to. And he saw all of the tragedy and all the horrible things that would happen. You know, you think about the great genocides that we have seen in the world. I was just reading today, I was just doing some research about Guatemala, a particular town that I'm interested in, and they had a genocide occurred. There was a civil war in Guatemala back in the 80s, and there was about 220,000 people that were murdered, mostly by the military and militia groups and so on and so forth. But most of them were indigenous peoples. And so God was aware that all these horrendous and yet still created, because he valued the communion that he with us greater than all the tragedy. It wasn't something exterior to him, right? It wasn't like, you know, okay, I'm going to make a box and then I'm going to just destroy it. I'm going to throw it in the fire and burn it. Okay, no skin off my back. But that wasn't the case with the Lord. I remember one time my sister, and her favorite phrase to me was, you know, I'm not very religious, right? So my sister, not a Christian, one day, just out of the blue, she said, I don't know if I can believe in God with all this suffering. You know, all this suffering that goes on. I said, well, I would agree with you on that point. If it were not for the fact that God came down from heaven and offered himself on a cross, suffering immensely, a separation from his Father and himself that had never occurred in all of eternity. And then the physical suffering that he went through to redeem us back to himself. In other words, God had skin in the game. It wasn't something that he wasn't going to suffer for. He is known as the suffering servant of the Lord, Isaiah chapter 53. He knew before time, before he created time, right? We talked about that in Genesis chapter 1, that when he put the stars and the moon and stuff, and he started the circulation of the earth, that's when time started. Before that, there was no time. Didn't exist, because God's eternal. He doesn't have a clock. Do you know that? God doesn't have a clock. He operates with us because we needed a clock for the manner in which he created us. But God didn't need it. But he knew before anything occurred that he was going to have to save by sending his son to suffer in our place. And he still did it. What does that tell you about your value to him?
That's awesome. Great.
Yes. And I think that that's one of the things that we see is affirming that if our Creator, the Lord God of the heavens, deemed it worthy and necessary to save by giving his own life, the value that he places upon us must be beyond our comprehension. Because I don't get it. Sorry, Ray, I like you, but you know what I'm saying? How much of that is there in the world, right? He said in John, greater love has no man than this, and that a man will lay down his life for his friend. And really, this whole process that we're seeing in the book of Genesis. Who else has an observation?
Well, I guess my observation would be just kind of along the line of what you were saying, how it's through grace at all, but how is grace actually extended from the very beginning through these like certain individuals. It was his grace that led up to Jesus even being in a sense,
Yeah.
right? All through his line, there's just grace.
Mhm.
You know, there's unmerited favor. I mean, like Abraham, I love Abraham because he's just such a mess at times. And,
What about Jacob?
oh, yeah, for sure.
I mean, he's the misfit of the clan.
But yeah, how it just extended right, you know.
Yeah.
There, you know, man fell, and but he just, the whole story, he sticks with his creation.
You know, on the other hand, you know, as you're saying that, I think that it would also be fair to say that while we observe and are moved by the grace and the goodness of God, Paul always keeps together as one unit the goodness and the severity of God. And if you look at this book, there's a lot of severity. There's a lot of severity to those who disobey. The whole pre-Diluvian world, that would be the world of the flood, right? The people who were during the flood. Deluge. He didn't spare them. One family, 8 souls, and all the animals. And even most of the animals were killed as well. So it wasn't just human beings, it was all flesh. So there's a severity there. And you look of course at Sodom and Gomorrah, right? I mean, look at New York City. Is there any difference between New York City and Sodom? I mean, we have gay pride parades that are horrendous. Horrendous stuff that goes on. And yet we're seeing God patience, long suffering, but he has his severity regarding those things, that heart set, that mindset. He's not in agreement with it. And there will be judgment in the end. I mean, I don't know about here now, but yeah.
It's interesting to me that, to me it just tells me over and over again how truly, truly great he is. And with our minds, we can't come close to really understanding, because with the creation and then these people, the different things that they did, and then in the ark the people were acting up, and more the people are acting up, and here we are how many years later still doing it. So it just seems very obvious to me he's totally beyond our comprehension, because the way we think, after a while you'd say, maybe I better do plan B.
Yeah.
Because this is, you know,
This isn't working.
it's not working, so, and we know he doesn't take. So it just, to me, it just shows me that he's much, much more than I ever imagined.
Yeah. Well, and I, you know, if you a summary of that, Proverbs chapter 3. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding. Right? In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. And I think that is a wonderful lesson to bring, to see the infinity and the greatness of God. You know, it should bring us to a place of absolute childlike confidence. my Father's going to take care of this. I don't know how, I don't know when, I don't know by what means, and I don't care. But he's going to care of me and mine.
It's overwhelming.
It is. It is. Causes our hope and our faith to soar. Even, all of us in here, most of us have gone through some high waters, where our faith has been tried and we've wondered, where is the God of our salvation? Why are these things happening around me if he is indeed so great? And why does God allow that testing period to take us to, like, the end of ourselves? He's after something different. He's after something more than simply satisfying us. After making us in his own image, so that there is a perfect unity between his heart and ours. There's no shade of difference. That's the high thing that God is working. That is the ultimate, is that your heart and my heart are becoming an exact replica or reflection of his heart. And in this world, right, in the circumstances that we live in, suffering is just a part of the process, because we live in a fallen world. We live where bad things happen to us. This is what the story of the book of Job tells us. A man who God said was just. Job. And he suffered immensely. Immensely. And yet God worked in him and brought him to that like place. At the very end, where God is reading Job's riot act, and where were you when I did this? Where were you when I did that? In other words, I am beyond you. I'm so much bigger than you, so much beyond you. And like the prophet, he said to the prophet Isaiah, my thoughts aren't your thoughts. My ways aren't your ways. My ways and my thoughts are so much higher than your ways and your thoughts that you will never cross the chasm. It's too big. I have to reveal myself to you, little by little, so that you can handle a little at a time. And that's a great place to be, right? To understand who he is and who we are. And that is one of the things that the book of Genesis does for us. It sets that relationship correctly. God and me. Right? And when that relationship is true and correct, portion that we are nothing, right? But we ain't him. And we've already talked about the value that he sees in us. But we aren't him. And we will never comprehend him. Through all eternity, we will never comprehend him. Why? We have to be God to comprehend him. And we're not God, we're a creature. And that's one of the things that Genesis teaches us. Look, you're just my creature, you're limited little beings. I made you. The song said, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Absolutely. But you're not God. You're not God. I'm not God. God is God. And it's very humbling to actually stop and think, somebody made me. I'm made. I wasn't always here. There was a time when I was conceived and I came in to this world naked. And a time is coming when I'm leaving this world naked. I came with nothing, I'm leaving with nothing. And everything that happened in between was the grace and the goodness and the mercy of God. Does anybody else have a...
I just have a kind of a question, but an observation. I don't know. If God knows everything that was going to happen before he even created it all, then he knew that he was going to take a bite from the apple.
Mm-hmm.
So
The fruit, not necessarily.
the fruit.
since we're studying Genesis.
Yeah. So,
Normally I wouldn't pick on you for that.
Off the tree.
It just has a fruit.
so I would just, it gives choice. And
Mhm.
that's where choice came into being.
Yeah.
And it's our choice in what we do, no matter, even if things are laid out, it's still, we still have choice.
Mhm. Then this is one of the great things, right? Where you look, and this is what we're doing here to a certain extent. We're looking at the idea of not just the infinity of God, but the sovereignty of God. In other words, God chooses. And yet, He has given man the ability to choose. Something that's very God-like. Now, we don't have the same power to choose that He does. His choices are infinite. He can do anything. Our choices are restrained. I can only choose between certain things. So I don't have freedom of choice in the sense that God has freedom of choice.
Correct.
However, He gives me choices. For example, in the book of Joshua, at the very end, Joshua says, look, I know you're a stubborn, rebellious people. You're not going to serve the Lord. I know it. And he says, choose you this day whom you will serve. The God that you served on the other side of the great thing, of the sea, or the Lord your God. Choose you this day. So there's a choice, right? Whosoever will, in the New Testament, that whole idea rings right through it. You know, but somehow there's a sovereignty of God and an election, that God makes a choice, right? But that He gives us a choice within the choice.
Right.
Even though He knows what you're going to choose, you can get anything. But did He determine that you would make the choice? This is the question. These are some of the great theological questions, right?
Absolutely.
And I think we have to come back to God is so great, and God is so big, and all this stuff is so confusing. I'm saved, I'm thankful, I'm trying to understand,
Amen.
but I'm going to eat a little humble pie,
Amen.
especially on some of these ideas of God's sovereign choices and man's limited choices. Nonetheless, He clearly gives us choice. He clearly deals about obedience and disobedience. He clearly says that through Stephen in the book of Acts regarding the nation of Israel, you do always resist the Holy Spirit. Even when Jesus was manifest, it says He came unto His own, His chosen people. And what did they do? They rejected Him. So, is there such a thing as irresistible grace? No, I think that's just a theological made-up word. There's no way you can resist the grace of God. Well, people are still doing it. People are hearing the word of God, which is the grace of God, being ministered to them, and they're saying no to God. And because of that no, because of that rebellion, they're going to be judged. Ultimately, does God know that they're already judged? And that they're, yes, of course He does. But He still calls out. He still calls out. Jesus said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto myself. Talking about the cross, right? Through the cross, He would draw. But many would say no. You know, He talked about sending out people. I'm making a big wedding for my son. Go and invite the people. Well, and they haven't showed up. Okay, well, go out and tell the towns and bring them in. Okay, we've done that, and there's still room. Go out and compel them. Force them to come. We have, and there's still room. Okay, I've done what I could. So it's a crazy mixture of things where, as a man, I know that I have a choice. But as God, He knows my choice already. He knew it before He made anything. He knows everything. It's hard stuff.
It's really God who draws us to Him.
Yes?
Because no one comes to Him unless the Spirit of God draws Him.
Yep.
So He knows who we are because our names were written in the Lamb's Book of before the foundation.
But there is the possibility, of your name being blotted out.
I'm not going.
It gets pretty hairy when you bring some of this stuff into it.
You know, as you get older, you're like Peter, you know, where are you gonna go?
Yeah.
God has the words of
Eternal life.
and that means more to you than any of it, or anywhere.
Right, right.
But I'm always
Well-
thankful that God's Spirit drew me,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I'm thankful.
Well, let me talk about that for a second, because, you know, when we're looking at some of these things, and you're looking at some of this stuff, the reality of God in your life. I was just talking to Pastor Mike about this, you know, because, and my daughter too, Jake too.
Hey, what?
Yeah. Second generation Christians. Okay? Their relationship with God began as children. They were just brought into, it was normal for them. But a lot of us, we kookiness. I mean, we came out of bad life. And the new birth took hold in us. Man, we knew it. Because there was such a radical change in our lives, in our thinking, in everything, and it was now. I think that, you know, some people will scorn the experience that we have of God, but a lot of things can be snatched from you intellectually. Somebody can come or whatever than you. What can never be taken away from you is that union that He created between His heart and your heart. Nobody can tell me God doesn't live in me. You know, and our second generation people, they get that same union, but generally it comes in a different. I mean, there comes a realization in their lives as well that they belong to God and He belongs to them. And there is that experience with God that, frankly, if you don't, you're not going to survive the trials and the tests and all the things that go on around you. In other words, there has to be fruit of a relationship. Your relationship, our relationship with God. There's got to be a fruit, a reality. It can't just be, I know these verses. I know that the Bible teaches, just a doctrine. And I believe that doctrine. But there's no reality of it. There has to be a reality. So that when all these crazy that are incomprehensible to me, and let's face it, you look at the big old world today, who here can actually say you understand it? Let me ask you, who's lying more? President Trump or Vice President Biden? Who's telling the truth? Do we really know?
No.
In a great majority of this stuff, we have no idea, because there are so many layers of lies being told that you can't possibly sift it all down and fact check it. Right? It's too big for us. You think God's fooled by any of it?
No.
Not a bit. But we are. So there comes a place where that childlike faith that was born out of a real encounter with God has to be that guiding force, principle in your life. Yes, brother.
Yes, when you was making that statement about God choose, or His choice, our choice, and His choice is our choice. When you was making that statement, right, I was thinking about the different events that happened in Genesis. When it came to Adam and Eve, and when it came to, Abraham and Lot, and, Joseph and all these individuals. Because God chose, He chose to create Adam.
Mm-hmm.
He chose Abraham and separate himself from his family and so forth and so forth. So
Yeah.
He chose these men and these women and these stories to bring about His plan. But within that choice, He allowed us to choose and make some decisions. But His plan was going to continue on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I love about
With or without us.
Right, so, because me and you had a discussion about Joseph, about his coat and the dreams that he had, and he shared with his brother, which, you know, me, he was talking about premature, or his pride was in the, when he started stating this with his brothers, and you said it still was gonna happen. And I was like, you really think it was? If you wouldn't have told him? But that's our God. Yes, it's gonna come about
Yeah,
if we choose to do it or not.
yeah,
He's gonna make it happen, but his choice of the individual, he is sure that it's gonna come about. We stumble along the way.
Yeah.
So
We
we
can-
make that really.
yeah, we can, his plan is gonna take place. Whether it has to go to a plan B within plan A, in other words, he comes to a man and the man says no. Well, God's gonna find somebody else to fill that spot. One of the great examples is when the right came to Jesus and said, "What do I do to be saved?" Well, could keep the commandments. Well, I've done that. One thing you lack: go sell all that you have and come and follow me.
Right.
What does it say he did? He went the other way.
Yeah.
Because he had another God. That was the one thing in his life that hindered him from fulfilling the plan that God had for his life. His plan. Jesus never said that statement, by the way, to anybody but apostles. Nobody. And there were plenty of people that followed him, but that Jesus followed me, it was always apostles. But he rejected it.
Wow.
So Judas was a different story, right? He was marked, but for evil. He was going to do what he was going to do. He was going to turn over the Christ, because that's what he was created for. Yeah, and God can do that. God can create a vessel for honor, to show his mercy in it, or he can create a vessel for evil, and to show his anger.
Come on, say that.
He can do it. He does. But I believe in general, our choice to determine the outcome, although he knows what that outcome is. Anyway.